Okay, so here we are with the Newfangled Audio Elevate plugin. Now this is a limiter, but it's more than just a limiter. And I'm doing a review of it because I'm very impressed by this. I've been using it for a while, and it really can do things no other limiter can do, in my view, especially for the kind of music that I mix and master, that I specialize in, which is jazz, progressive rock, and other acoustic music from around the world, and some classical music. These are genres where transparency is your ultimate goal. And transparency means preserving as much dynamic range as you can while getting the level up as loud as you can. But you don't want to lose noticeably your dynamic range, and you don't want to introduce distortion, which is noticeable. So before we get started, if you can subscribe and ring the bell, press the thanks buttons, really helpful for keeping the channel going, and like the video. That's all super helpful. It just takes a second to click, so really appreciate it. Okay, so let's get back to it. Limiting does add distortion. Even small amounts that you might not notice as distortion, they are there, and the harder you push it and the louder you make it, the more prominent that becomes, and the more it changes the sound in a way which has become part of some genres of music, like some genres of rock and pop, pushing it hard into the limiter and making it very loud, which adds hefty amounts of digital distortion, is part of the sound of the genre. Now, it's not like the sort of distortion you get from a guitar amp or from a kind of signal breakup or something like that. So you probably don't recognize it as that, but it is changing the wave shape, the shape of the wave of the signal, and that is a type of distortion, and it's a uniquely digital kind of distortion, which, as I say, has become part of the sound of rock and pop for decades now. So we're all used to hearing it. We don't think of it as distortion, but it is. And because those genres, that's part of the sound, it's not something anybody thinks twice about. But when you're talking about acoustic music or electric music where maximum dynamic ranges and you don't want added distortion, you want it to sound as natural to the instruments as they were recorded as you can, you don't want to introduce that. You can very much hear the difference, and you can hear that, like, oh, something's been done to this as soon as you start pushing the limiter. Whereas with rock and pop, you can hear something's done to it, but what's done to it is like what you expect the sound to be. So it's quite different with these different genres, and it's always been a challenge to get the levels up with jazz and acoustic music without making it sound like it's being limited and you've got that change in the sound, the artificial kind of moving away from the natural sound. And that's what's great about Elevate, is I can push things way further with this while keeping it sound very close to the original than I can with any other limiter. And I have tried pushing Pro L2, Fab Filter, Ozone, Maximizer, BX True P, Xenon, TDR limiter. I've tried pushing all of those to, and of course I haven't tried every limiter out there, but I've tried all of those, and I've tried pushing them to the levels that I can get Elevate to see what it sounds like. And this is beyond levels that I'd ever normally push things with these genres, which I'll play you in a minute so you can hear. And none of them are anywhere close to the kind of transparency that I can get with Elevate. So the way I'm going to measure the loudness in this case is not so much the loudness itself. Now, what is that PSR, peak to short-term ratio? It's a measurement not of loudness exactly, but of how much difference you have between the short-term loudness measured in the short term against the peak, the loudest, not against the quietest, but against the short-term sort of average of the short-term loudness. And it gives you a pretty good indication, or a very good indication, of how much you've crushed the dynamic range and how much limiting you're doing. So you really can push this to much higher levels and keep it sounding really transparent than I would normally ever be able to push it. Normally, I would say with a section like this of the music, I wouldn't push it further than like 7 PSR, peak to short-term loudness ratio. But I can push it significantly farther than that with Elevate, and it still sounds really good. But I would say that you do need to learn this plugin to be able to push it that hard. Yes, it sounds great out of the box, but you're not going to push things that far and keep them as transparent until you've made use and learned how this stuff works. That is the whole deal with this. It offers you the ability to take things further and make things even more transparent, but that's by using the tools that it has, and is kind of a toolbox in a sense for people that, well, for professional mastering engineers. So I would say you can't just expect to chuck this on your mix, push it that hard and get the level of transparency that you're going to hear now. You have to learn how to use it and tweak it and understand a bit about how all these processes work with transients and limiting, per band limiting and all of that sort of thing, and get to know it. But if you learn it, you can really achieve amazing things with this that no other limiter that I've ever tried can do. So I'm going to push this up to 4. So the lower the number, the more you've crushed it. So let's just say I would normally start, this piece of music without any limiting is a 9. This section of music I'm going to play you a peak to short-term ratio of 9. And that is unlimited. The only compression is, individual compressors on some of the instruments, as you would in any mix, or in a lot of mixes. Certainly any mix that's been done in a close mic'd mix, like this one. So you can hear what that sounds like, and then I'm going to put in this limiter, and it's compressed pretty extremely, way, way past what I'd ever do for this kind of music, down to 4. And as I've said, I normally wouldn't go past about 8, maybe 7. Now, it's also worth noting that I've chosen a loud part of the song here. So loud parts of songs where everybody's playing full on always have a naturally lower peak to short-term loudness ratio anyway, because everybody's kind of playing full on together. So it just naturally lowers that number a bit. So it's naturally lowered it to 9, but other parts of the song and the song taken overall, it would probably be significantly lower, like, 12 or something. So I've taken it from 9, which it naturally is in this section, down to a 4, which is way past what I would do. So I'm going to play it without, and one of the great things about Elevate is that it's got a very good automatic loudness matcher, and I find this it works really well. You turn this on and it matches the loudness when you bypass it. So I'll bypass it here, and I'm going to keep this in, which means it's not going to be, it turns it down significantly to match the bypass level. It does a really good job of it. And it allows you to hear what it's really doing to it. And if you're using a limiter that doesn't have this kind of a function on it, it's near impossible to tell what you're really doing to the music, because it's so much louder than when you bypass it. It's not a small difference, it's probably going to be several dB, 2 to 5 dB or whatever you've brought it up to, a lot louder. So it's impossible to judge what changes you've done in the sound. I think that is something that mastering engineers have always had to just try to deal with. But what's great is some modern limiters allow you to actually match it, and you can actually hear what it's really doing, which is one of the great things I like about this. So I'm going to start by playing it for you, and then after that I'm going to go through all the features and show you what it's got. So I'm going to play it first without, so you can hear what this section sounds like. So it's just looping around that part, and you can hear that's without the limiter. And now I'm going to bring the limiter in and out. I'm going to start without, and then I'm going to bring it in. I mean, that's remarkable. That's down at PSR 4, and you can see there is a lot of limiting going on. It's really limiting it. It's pushing it hard into the limiter in a way I would never, ever do with this kind of music. This is for demonstration purposes. And yeah, you can hear something, but the difference is small when you bypass it. It's remarkable. And as I said, I've tried it with a bunch of other limiters, and then it's really different. You know, the sound when you bypass it, even if you level match it, it's really, really different. They're just not capable of this level of transparency whatsoever, not even close. For this kind of music, anyway, into my ears, I would say that there's no real comparison. So now maybe I'm not saying there's no other limiter out there. I haven't tried every limiter in the world, but as I mentioned the ones before, I have tried against this. So before we go any further, I'm just going to show you what it is like with taking out this auto button, so you can hear how much louder it actually makes it. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to bypass it and then bring it in. So I've turned the level down so that when it's brought in, so the bypass signal is going to be a lot quieter than it was. And the limited version is going to be up at the level that we have been listening to it. Because obviously I couldn't make it go even louder, or it would overload. So the sound you hear when it's bypassed is the level it is before limiting, and then when the limiter comes in, that's the level the limiters bring it to, with the amount of compression that I was limiting I was giving. So let's have a listen to that. So significantly louder. Now let's bring this down to a little bit more of a reasonable level, just so we can hear what that's like. This is at a level of 7 PSR, which is more what I would expect for a section like this, of a track like this. You'll hear it still gets louder, not as much louder as when I was pushing it to 4, obviously. This is a level that would be more, normal, where you're really not going to hear any kind of artifacts, but you're still getting the level up a bit. I've pulled the transient emphasis back a bit. It wasn't necessary to have it as pushed as hard when it was not being, limiting wasn't as strong. So let's have a listen now to this before and then after. Useful to hear it with that in, so you could hear the matched levels and how similar it was, and how unaffected it was. But now we've taken this out, we'll hear the level difference, starting with it out. So still, significantly louder, nothing like as loud as pushing it to 4 PSR, obviously. This is at 7, but you can hear just, again, at that level, it's ultra transparent, still sounding really punchy and clear and clean and open. Yeah, fantastic. So let's go through this and see what it has. It's got some really interesting and unique features. And Newfangled Audio, which I believe are some of the people from Eventide, and it is sold by Eventide through the Eventide website, and I believe it is people from Eventide that split off and formed Newfangled Audio. So it's got some seriously good programming behind it and seriously good audio DSP knowledge behind it. Partly what makes it look complicated is this screen here, where you've got this filter bank, which is how it works. It splits the spectrum up into lots of bands. It's all linear phase, so you don't get phase issues. And if you set it up when it comes out of the box, as it were, it's set to the Mel scale like this, which is the scale naturally set to human hearing, where the human hearing is most sensitive. And so that it's going to limit each of these bands separately. And that's partly what makes it transparent. But by changing these, you actually can get it even more transparent in some cases, and it depends. And you can see with this one, the way I had it set, see if I've undone that, yeah. This, I've made a wider gap here. Basically, this is saying, you know, this area is going to be treated as one. And you can manipulate this so that you get the sound that you want, or so that you get it, in my case, as transparent as you can. And you can solo each of these bands and so forth. I'm not going to go every tiny detail here, but just to show you that I find that most of the time you'll get a great result by just using the default Mel scale. But sometimes that extra 5% or even that extra 3% of transparency you can get by just tailoring this a little bit. And it's actually not that hard to do. So let's go back to the main section here. That's just a bit of an overview of kind of generally how it works. And it uses that division of the signal for some of its other functions, which we'll look at. But to start with here, we've got true peak, which is useful. I know some people don't like it. I don't have a problem with it. Maybe you hear it more if you're playing music that's crushed into the limiter a lot. With the kind of music I do, I'm not hearing a bad problem from that at all. So having that on, and it's very useful for streaming to have true peak, because otherwise you've got to give yourself that much extra headroom. And that can just be a hassle and difficult to control when you're talking about mastered for iTunes. You've got to set it one way, and then for other services another way, and so forth. So true peak means that you've got a point, you know where you are, it's clear, and you can change the output as you need to for the different platforms without like having to get out the calculator. Okay, so this is kind of like your drive in a way. It's the gain into the limiter. It is just like a clean gain as far as I can tell. I mean, you could push the signal harder into this, with a gain plug-in. I think we do exactly the same thing as this. But it's also got adaptive gain, and what that means is that the more you turn this up, the more it adapts the gain dependent on what it, using its own kind of built-in algorithmic intelligence, if you want to call it that, it's built-in algorithms to determine what dynamically change the amount of gain on each of these bands. So you can turn this off entirely, you can bring this up and down so that it's just acting uniformly across all those bands, or the more you turn this up, the more it varies intelligently how much it is limiting per, dynamically across the bands. That has a lot to do with the transparency, the ability to do that. Doesn't mean you always whack this up to full. You've got to find a sweet spot, but again, you just experiment a little bit, and you can turn it off and on here, so you can hear what you've done against having no adaptive gain. Very useful. It's kind of like an A/B for the adaptive gain. Super useful. Then you've got your speed, how fast it's reacting. Amazingly, it's got adaptive speed as well. And again, it works exactly the same way. It adapts the speed of the limiter differently for each of the bands. And again, that has a lot to do with the transparency. So you move this until it's got the sweet spot for the kind of music you've got going on, and the same thing with the adaptive speed. For this particular track, I found it actually sounded best at full adaptive speed, but again, you have to experiment, and you've got the A/B switch here. Then you've got your ceiling. This is just like the final output ceiling. I've just got it at 0.1 dB down from full as a just safety thing. To be honest, I usually have it 0.4, but it just happens to be there. And now we go on to the transient emphasis. And this has, again, a big part of what makes this so transparent is that you can emphasize the transients. Now, there are other limiters that can do that, like L2 and others. But again, this does it via this filter bank. So it does it dynamically depending on if you set up this adaptive transient thing here, it dynamically change how much it emphasizes the transients depending on the area of the spectrum. And again, you've got the amount here, and you can A and B that, and so forth. Now this, I find, is that final 10% actually. It's a big amount, maybe even more than 10% of that transparency, because especially when you're pushing it hard. When you're pushing something hard, one of the things you lose is you start to lose those transients. You start to lose the punch. And that's partly how I was able to push this thing to a PLR of 4, which is ridiculously crushed, but it still sounds punchy. And it sounds very close to the original. A lot of it is to do with the rest of what I've explained, but also this transient emphasis, which you can see I've got pushed pretty hard here. And I've given it a fair amount of adaptive transient response across the bands. And it's amazing how it brings the transients back, even though you've crushed the hell out of them. So it's amazing. So it's got that, and then it's got a clipper. And with a clipper, I was just going to go to the transient thing, actually. Actually, I won't go to that quite yet. I'm going to go back here and just finish, then I'll go into the details. So the clipper, it just drives a clipper, basically. If you use clippers, I don't tend to use them much unless I've got something that's got, the odd really spiky thing that's going up way past everything else. I mean, this looks like it does, but when you zoom in, it doesn't really that much. The loudest points, yeah, there's a little bit here. You might find that that's useful, a clipper for something like that. If you just want to take off the very highest spikes, I might use it. But I rarely find I need to. And the reason you might use it is because it means the rest of the limiter doesn't have to work as hard. So, yeah, it just gives you that little bit of extra level. But, the kind of music I do, that's not normally that necessary. So I don't often use it, but occasionally I will use it a little bit. Okay, so now let's look at the details. So we looked at the filter bank. We look at the EQ, limiter EQ. This, it's kind of like an EQ, but it's based on the limiter. So it's how much limiting is going on per EQ band, and you can adjust it. Now, it's got its adaptive gain. If you look here, these controls here, limiter adaptive gain, it's duplicated over here again, and the limiter gain, they're both duplicated. So these two controls are on the main page as well, but they've just put them along the top here, which is useful to be able to get to them again on this screen. But what it means is that you can emphasize areas of this a spectrum based on the filter bank that you've got set up over here, and so areas will get more or less limited. So you're kind of biasing the adaptive gain. If you're using adaptive gain, you can say, well, the adaptive gain is going to decide to do a certain thing, but I'm feeling like I need a little bit more in the low end, and you can bring the low end up, which means it's going to limit that. It's going to bias that low end even more within the limiting and allow it to come through a bit more. I found that to be really, really useful and really important. And one of the things I found, comparing this to the L2, one of the things the L2 has, I don't tend to use the L2 that much for this kind of music, because before I started using Elevate, I was using Xenon, which is super transparent, as long as you don't push it too hard. But then you push it too hard and it breaks up pretty quick. But if you're not having to push things hard, like I normally wouldn't with the kind of music I master, it's very transparent and doesn't color things, which I really like about it. But what I find about L2 is if you're pushing things a bit harder, it's got a nice thing it does with the low end. And when I first started using Elevate, I thought, yeah, it's way more transparent than L2 when you push it hard, but the low end is not kind of quite as warm and round as the L2 has this kind of nice thing it does down there. But I found it was very easy to replicate that by just simply pushing this up, just doing this basically, sounded like an L2 at the low end. So yeah, it's fantastic. And of course, you could do all kinds of things with the high end. If you're finding that, the high end is too prominent, once you've pushed it a bit harder, you can pull these down. Or if you just find that it's not transparent enough, you might find that by pulling some of these up or down, you'll bring that a little bit more transparent sound. So now moving on to the transient. Now this is super useful. I find myself using this a lot in certain circumstances. It's basically the same idea, but this is transient emphasis. So if you've emphasized the transients, you could just leave this flat. It does a fantastic job with its intelligent algorithm. And if you allow it to be adaptive, it uses the algorithm. But if you're finding that even with this, you're thinking, well, I'd really like a little bit more punch in the low end, or a little, the snare is sounding a little bit too sharp now. Like I'm liking the way the transients are sounding. It's sounding very close to the original, even though I'm pushing it harder than I'd like to. But although most everything's sounding very close to the original, the snare is snapping just a little bit too much now. You can just pull it down a little bit here. So it's just like I find I use this as just a fine-tuned tailoring of getting it closer to the original unlimited sound. But you could use this for creative effects and give the whole mix more punch than it had before limiting, or whatever you wanted to do in certain frequency areas. So finally we have here the clipper, and you can change the shape of the clipper to be harder or softer and drive it here and so forth. If you drive the clipper, you can see the shape change more obviously here. That's hard, that's soft. And again, this is something people like a lot. Some people like to use a lot, and some people like me don't use it that often, but I will on occasion use it. More to solve a problem than anything else. If I just need to bump something up a little bit in loudness and I'm finding I've kind of hit the limits, sometimes a little bit of clipping can bump it up that little bit more, and then actually you don't hear it. So again, the kind of music I'm doing, I'm always trying not to hear what I'm doing with limiting, because that's the point. You don't want to have that. You don't want to hear that limiting effect. It wants to be as transparent as possible. So finally here, you have metering. You've got an in and output metering, different types of metering, which I'm not going to go over the differences here, but it's very easy. Actually, I will. I'll just play and just show you the differences. So you've got your input and output here. So difference between input and output, you can see, the lighter and darker bands there. This is just gain reduction. So you can see the lines are going both ways. So it's getting reduced and getting boosted. The transient's getting boosted. So you can see both of them happening. And then finally, you've got the filter bank, which along the top, it shows you how much is being reduced by each of the bands. So the bottom shows you what the bands are doing. The blue is the level coming in. The yellow is the level going out of each of those bands. And the orange ones coming down from the top are the actual gain reduction meters per band. So, these are just basically useful, and they've got, even sub things you can stick on here, for which I won't go through all the details of that, but it's very heavily detailed if you need it. It's got a couple of different level matching things here, which are super useful. And I think that I'm not going to go, it's not going to be an exhaustive walkthrough of it, but I've gone through most of it, I think, to give you an idea. And it looks it looks kind of complicated, but it actually isn't. You just spend a bit of time with it, and especially if you've been working with limiters for decades, like I have, you know what you're after, and you suddenly see, oh wow, I can do this and I can do that. I think you get, if you're used to them, if you experience with them, I think you actually get to grips with it really quickly. So yeah, this is highly recommended, and I hope you found this useful. If you did, give the video a like and ring the bell and subscribe. And if you can press the thanks button, that's really useful. And hope to see you next time.